All right, so I'm going to be speaking about water. So this is a map that looks at water scores from different countries. So scores of sanitation and clean water. So the darker colors have higher scores and the lighter colors have lower scores. So you can see a vast majority of our planet actually needs safer water. So 2.2 billion people lack access to safely managed water. 3.4 billion lack safely managed sanitation, which is what impacts water the vast majority of the time, and 1.7 billion lack basic hygiene services just at home. So the UN has come up with 17 sustainable development goals. Clean water is one of those, number 6. But you can see that from listening to our prior talks, many other goals directly impact whether you're going to have clean water. So poverty, good health and well-being, quality education, affordable energy, your infrastructure, sustainable energy, responsible consumption, et cetera, et cetera. And many deaths are related to chemical pollution, as we've heard. Air pollution is key. Water pollution's right after that. Bottom right, you can actually see how many deaths are attributed to water pollution. So in Angola, India, Kenya, Ghana, Indonesia, these areas have a lot of water pollution impacting morbidity and also mortality. So toxins in water. I'm charged with talking about these 3 toxins, which I actually knew nothing about. I was like, why can't I talk about cholesterol or blood pressure or valve disease or heart failure? But I'm actually grateful that I learned about this. So first we're going to talk about PFAS. So this is going back to one of my favorite organic chemistry classes. They're per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, sometimes known as forever chemicals. So there are 5,000 different PFAS, and they're basically a carbon or alkyl backbone surrounded by fluorine atoms. How can I be exposed? This is what we're all wondering when we come to this talk. Like, where am I going to get the PFAS from? So various foods, so marine kind of animals that are exposed to PFAS, or food packaging, when you think about the grease liner in your food packaging that you're getting or to-go box, in your drinking water. So typical water treatment doesn't necessarily remove PFAS, but some home filters can remove it. And then dust exposure. So some of the carpets or textiles in your home may be shedding some PFAS that you're ingesting really, really small amounts or inhaling small amounts. So what are the products? Here are several different products. There's clothing and textiles, carpeting and flooring, nonstick cookware. The water-resistant clothing that you wear may have PFAS. So a lot of different areas may actually be exposing you unknowingly. So you can actually look up where PFAS contamination is really important in your neighborhood. So the light blue is drinking water above the proposed limit for PFAS, and then the dark blue is drinking water below the proposed limit. So you can type in your address. I typed in Pacific Heart. We will live forever at Pacific Heart if we get a water filter, I think, because our drinking water is apparently slightly above the proposed limit, interestingly. But this is again from 2025, so hopefully we are now in better shape. And there are many different organic pollutants out there. One of them is PFAS, and one of the various mechanisms that can lead to coronary disease, peripheral arterial disease, are things like oxidative stress, systemic inflammation, and endocrine disruption. You can see our distinguished speaker, Dr. Rajagopalan, is one of the authors of this. So I've borrowed several figures from some of his papers for this talk. And human studies suggest that we can be exposed to PFAS, and it can actually affect many different organ systems: the thyroid, fertility in women, lower infant birth weight, et cetera, et cetera. One proposed mechanism is by altering the way platelets function and can increase arterial thrombosis, and the way that we're responding to these can, over time, kind of gradual insults, increase our risk for atherosclerosis as well. So moving to microplastics, we already heard there's not a completely agreed upon scientific definition, but essentially it's a plastic particle less than 5 millimeters. There's even nanoparticles less than 1 micron or 1 micrometer. And how do they get into your water? So wastewater is one way. It can also get in through sewer overflows, atmospheric deposition, surface runoff, even plastic waste, and maybe your plastic bottles and caps. This is an interesting study looking at BPA exposed mice, and they actually saw that they were developing lipids, kind of the fat accumulation in their liver. And that altered lipid metabolism, the way that the lipids were working, glucose homeostasis, how they process glucose, and over time increased obesity in those mice. So, how do the risks from microplastics stack up against other risks? So, microbial pathogens are actually a really important risk factor for water pollution. Um, about 500,000 diarrheal deaths were attributed to microbial pathogens, so fecally contaminated water. And you might say, you know what, that doesn't really apply to us here in the US, and we're just focusing on ourselves here. But actually, 15% of the US, or 43 million people, rely on private wells. And within these private wells, including areas of California, have microorganisms. So Campylobacter, Shigella, Yersinia, E. coli, et cetera, which can lead to norovirus, rotavirus, a lot of these diarrheal illnesses, among other chemicals. So some of the other chemicals can be metals, pesticides, et cetera. So moving on, then I'm going to go to metals now. So we heard about arsenic, lead, and cadmium. This is also from a paper that Dr. Rajagopalan wrote about environmental pollution and cardiovascular disease. So you see these are some of the different metallic pollutants. And then over time, you can inhale them, ingest them, kind of many different ways that you can take them in. And then they can lead to these processes we've been talking about, like systemic inflammation, disruption of the lining of your blood vessels, and then lead to things like apoptosis, which is cell death, and then finally can affect these outcomes. So if you see the red, yellow, and green, that's cardiovascular disease, coronary disease, and stroke. And then 1 is kind of the reference here on relative risk. And whenever you see that bar going to the right, that increases your risk. So you can see how risk is going up in every single one of those areas almost with exposure to various metals. And then this shows you that really it's many different mechanisms working in parallel. So it's things like the alteration in lipid metabolism I talked about, but also oxidative stress, cell damage, kind of all working in concert. And then finally, this is another interesting slide showing that you could have multiple exposures. So you can be exposed to lead and metals, but also to pesticides. And these different pathways are quite complex, but working together to ultimately disrupt the regulatory systems that your body relies on. So here's a slide kind of showing over time all these different exposures and initiating mechanisms, pathways that then lead to plaque, and then ultimately, heart attack, stroke, etc. Interestingly, some of these metallic pollutants disproportionately affect women. This is something I didn't have an appreciation of, but during certain times in a woman's life, there is more lead in the bloodstream. So we talked about how the bone is a main repository for lead. And so during menopause and in pregnancy, there's more bone resorption and metabolism. So if women are exposed to additional lead in their environment during those times, they're actually at very increased risk for high blood pressure and even for preeclampsia, which is a very important cause of maternal mortality in our country. So when you're looking at, we always talk about risk assessment here and bringing it back to the topics I'm very comfortable with, like hypertension and cholesterol. So when I'm talking to people about their risk factors, I'm looking at those traditional risk factors, as well as in the middle column, the pregnancy-related risk factors like preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, diabetes, and then other female-specific factors, and then incorporating now environmental toxins. And so really, if you think about it, these pollutants can affect every organ system. They can go from head to toe, essentially your skin, your intestine, your lungs, and so on and so forth. So we know there are many harmful exposures like air pollution, noise pollution is another one, climate change, chemical pollution. Their pathways overlap and then can lead to issues as a result. So what can you do about it? It's not all doom and gloom. So we can test our water at home. If you think you might be living in a home that was built before 1986, for example, you might have lead piping, and that might be leaching into your water supply. So you might want to get it tested. Definitely, if you rely on a private well, you might want to get that water tested. So there are a lot of different situations where it might be helpful to look at your own water supply. And this is something I found on the EPA website that you can access. Other personal strategies limit pesticide use, PFAS, limit dietary metals, potentially filter your water, increase your fruit and vegetable intake. This was an interesting study of 13,000 women that actually higher magnesium concentration in drinking water was protective in a dose-dependent way. So for myocardial infarction, ischemic stroke, and hemorrhagic stroke, as the concentration of magnesium went up, the incidence of these went down, which I thought was pretty interesting. Also, diets rich in vegetables, fruit, fish, and white meat can attenuate cardiovascular effects of metals in water, also in a kind of dose-dependent way. It's hard to see, but at the bottom of these, it shows you occasionally, frequently, and almost every day for consumption of these different things. And actually, the risk that these different metals posed went down for heart failure, cardiovascular disease, and stroke the more vegetables, fruit, fish, and white meat that you incorporated into your diet. Finally, these are different ways you can filter your water. So you can use reverse osmosis, UV light, there's distillation and ozone methods. At home, you could use a countertop filter, and under the sink water filter. There's ways to disinfect water with chlorine. And then the other thing that's interesting is just thinking about your community. So if you're going to be going swimming in the water or surfing in the ocean within the last 3 days after a storm or rain, maybe not a great idea. This Surf for Health study out of UC Berkeley School of Public Health showed an increase by almost 3 times in GI illnesses, people going in the water after a rainstorm, for example. And that's something that looked at about 10,000 surfing events. And out of those, people had many more events of GI illnesses. This was an interesting study out of the Strong Heart study that we heard about earlier today, looking at ways that you can harness resources as a community. So facilitators went around and helped people in their homes actually install these arsenic removal devices, and people had great kind of outcomes after that. And then it really shows you that it's not just an individual, but it's at the facilitator level, and it's the whole community thinking about obstacles and trying to impact positive change. So that really takes us to the public health kind of and policy intervention. So we need to be doing many different things. We have to look at water infrastructure, protect our water kind of sources, strengthen monitoring, eliminate lead service lines, control emissions, and really kind of increase funding so that we can get this done. And so really it's governmental interventions as well as personal interventions that will create positive change ultimately. And so if we can kind of add the urban spatial planning to our supply side innovations like green energy, kind of using more electric, et cetera, then reduce our own exposures, which will then decrease the number of times you're getting these intermediary pathways that are damaging. Ultimately, we'll have fewer adverse cardiometabolic outcomes. And so this was actually an interesting video game I learned about called City Skylines, where if you're able to design your own city. I don't know if anybody's played this game before. Yeah, we have a few people. Okay. So you actually, it depends on, so you plan out your city, and if you put things like a water source next to an industrial plant or a sewage plant, your city is not going to prosper. So I thought it was pretty interesting that we're introducing this concept of how we lay out our cities really impacts like the kind of water supply you're going to have long term. And so in conclusion, 2.2 billion people lack access to safely managed drinking water. PFAS, microplastics, and metals are contaminants we know can down the line impact cardiovascular disease risk. Mechanisms are inflammation, oxidation, dysregulation, and epigenetic changes, and we can make interventions at a personal level, a community, and a government level. That's it.